You call that fixing a laptop?" The CEO snapped, her voice sharp enough to slice through the silent executive floor. It took my entire tech team 20 minutes and they still couldn't figure it out. The janitor didn't argue. He simply reached over, pressed 3 keys, adjusted a hidden system setting, and closed the diagnostic window before anyone else in the room even realized what he'd done. The laptop restarted smoothly. And for a moment, the most powerful woman in the building just stared at the quiet janitor standing beside her desk. Because sometimes the person everyone overlooks understands the system better than the people running it. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. No one in that glass tower had ever looked twice at the janitor pushing the cleaning cart down the hallway. But in the glow of that laptop screen, the CEO had seen something that didn't belong there. Not a movie, not social media. Lines of complex code, corporate architecture diagrams, encryption models her own engineers struggled to understand. And suddenly, the quiet janitor didn't look so ordinary anymore. The janitor's name was Daniel Armin. And the strange thing about Daniel was how calm he stayed when powerful people raised their voices. He didn't rush. He didn't flinch. He simply wiped his hands on a worn cloth tucked into his belt and stepped back from the CEO's desk. "I just restarted the secure partition," he said quietly. "Your system locked itself into diagnostic mode." The CEO narrowed her eyes. "You understood that?" Daniel gave a small shrug. "Sometimes computers panic like people do," he said. That answer didn't satisfy her. Across the vast executive office, floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the glowing skyline outside. Luxury cars moved like streams of light far below, while inside the office everything gleamed with quiet power, polished glass desks, sleek sculptures, expensive silence. Daniel stood in the middle of it, with oil-stained gloves and a cleaning cart. Completely out of place. And yet somehow, completely unbothered. Clara Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Systems, had built a billion-dollar cybersecurity empire by reading people faster than they could read her. And something about this janitor didn't add up. "How did you even know where to look?" she asked. Daniel hesitated just long enough to be noticeable. "Lucky guess," he said. She studied him another moment, then waved him away like a thought she couldn't quite place. "Fine, whatever. Just clean the hallway outside. My investors will be here in the morning." Daniel nodded once. Of course, he pushed his cart toward the door. The quiet squeak of the wheels echoed across the polished floor. Behind him, Clara reopened her laptop. For a moment she stared at the screen. Then her eyes narrowed. Because just before Daniel had closed the window, she'd seen something. A program, running in the background. Not one her engineers had installed, not one she recognized. Complex architecture maps filled with security pathways, system vulnerabilities, and encrypted frameworks. It looked less like random code and more like someone was studying the company's entire network. Meanwhile, Daniel stepped into the executive hallway and closed the door behind him. The bright office lights faded into the dim glow of the late-night corridor. Cleaning carts lined the wall. The building's hum surrounded him, air vents whispering, distant elevators moving, server rooms vibrating somewhere deep inside the tower. He exhaled slowly, then pulled a slim black laptop from the bottom shelf of his cart. The device looked old, scratched, ordinary. But when the screen lit up, complex security diagrams filled it instantly. Daniel studied them with quiet focus. Rows of code scrolled across the display. System architecture. Network pathways. And a flashing red warning buried deep inside the company's AI server structure. His eyes narrowed. "That's not good," he murmured. The vulnerability had grown worse overnight. Someone, somewhere was probing Whitmore Systems' network. Carefully, patiently, looking for a way inside. Daniel leaned back against the wall, rubbing his temples. He hadn't planned to get involved. This job was supposed to be simple. Quiet. Safe. Just a janitor pushing a cart through polished corridors, exactly the kind of life that let him pick up his daughter from school every afternoon. Exactly the kind of life that kept his past buried. His phone buzzed softly. A small photo appeared on the screen, a smiling little girl holding a science fair ribbon. Mila. Daniel's expression softened instantly. "Hey, kiddo," he whispered to the picture. He checked the time. Still a few hours before his shift ended. Still time before he went home and helped her finish building that cardboard robot she'd been working on all week. But the red warning on his laptop blinked again. Persistent. Dangerous. If he was reading the code correctly, Whitmore Systems didn't just have a minor glitch. They had a massive security hole. And tomorrow morning, when the investors arrived, that hole could turn into a disaster worth billions. Daniel closed the laptop slowly. "This isn't my problem," he muttered. He placed the device back into the cleaning cart, picked up his mop, and started down the hallway. But halfway down the corridor, he stopped. Because deep inside the building, far below the executive floors, an alarm suddenly began to echo through the tower. Soft, subtle, but unmistakable. A server alert. Daniel looked back toward the CEO's office, then toward the glowing elevator lights leading down to the server levels. And the quiet janitor sighed. Because sometimes, the hardest thing in the world wasn't solving a problem. It was pretending you didn't know how. And somewhere in the building's network, the problem was about to get a lot worse. The alarm kept echoing faintly through the tower. Not loud enough to send people running. Not dramatic enough to trigger a full evacuation. Just a quiet electronic pulse buried beneath the building's mechanical hum. Daniel stood still in the corridor, mop in hand, listening. Most people would have ignored it. Most people wouldn't even know what it meant. But he knew exactly what kind of alert produced that specific rhythm. A server integrity warning, and if it was the type he suspected, the company's internal network had already started fighting something. He exhaled slowly. "This isn't my job anymore," he murmured to himself. Still, his eyes drifted toward the elevator at the end of the hall. The doors opened with a soft chime. Two exhausted engineers stepped out, arguing quietly as they walked toward the executive wing. "I'm telling you, the system shouldn't be doing that," one said. "It's probably just a patch conflict," the other replied. "The CTO will handle it in the morning." Daniel lowered his head and pushed his cart past them. Invisible. Just another janitor finishing a night shift. But his mind was already racing. Patch conflict? No, that alarm pattern didn't belong to something simple. That was what happened when a network detected probing activity. Someone testing the doors. Someone trying to find a weakness. He reached the service elevator and pressed the button. The doors slid open. Cold air rushed up from the lower floors, the unmistakable chill of the company's server center. Daniel stepped inside. Just a quick look, he told himself. The elevator hummed downward. Floor numbers ticked past one by one. Executive level. Engineering. Research. Finally, server operations. The doors opened onto a massive underground room filled with rows of towering server racks. Blue indicator lights blinked in endless lines while cooling fans roared like distant wind. The room was nearly empty. Just one tired technician sitting at a console rubbing his eyes. Daniel rolled his cleaning cart forward. "Evening," the technician muttered without looking up. "Evening," Daniel replied. He began wiping down the floor near the wall. But his eyes were locked on the monitoring screens. Data streams flashed across them. Security protocols. Network traffic. And there it was, a subtle spike repeating every few seconds. Daniel's stomach tightened. Who installed the latest update? He asked casually. The technician glanced up. Engineering team earlier today. Why? Daniel shrugged lightly. Just curious. The technician leaned back in his chair. Honestly, the system's been acting weird since then. Keeps throwing tiny alerts. Nothing major, though. Daniel studied the numbers. Those weren't tiny alerts, those were test signals. Someone on the outside was mapping their defenses. Carefully. Patiently. And whoever it was, they were good. Very good. The technician yawned. Corporate's doing some huge investor presentation tomorrow morning, he said. Probably just stress on the servers. Daniel didn't respond. Because the code scrolling across the monitor told a very different story. Someone had already found a crack. Small, but real. If they pushed harder, the entire security structure could collapse. Billions of dollars, millions of private client records. Gone. And the engineers upstairs had no idea. Daniel finished wiping the floor and stepped back toward his cart. This isn't your fight, he reminded himself. He had walked away from that world for a reason. Late nights, endless pressure, corporate politics that cared more about profits than people, and most importantly, a little girl who needed her dad home. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Another photo from Mila popped up. This time, she was holding a half-finished cardboard robot. A message appeared beneath it. Do you think we can make the arms move tomorrow? Daniel smiled. Yeah, kiddo, he whispered softly. Tomorrow, he slipped the phone away and started pushing the cart back toward the elevator. Behind him, the technician stretched his arms. Hey, the man said suddenly. Daniel paused. You're that guy who fixed the CEO's laptop earlier, right? Daniel turned slightly. Just rebooted it, the technician laughed. Still, she was furious before that. You probably saved someone's job. Daniel gave a quiet nod, then stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. As the elevator rose back toward the upper floors, the server alert echoed again through the building. Longer this time. More urgent. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. Someone's getting bold, he muttered. The elevator opened again on the executive level. The hallway was darker now, almost empty. Most employees had gone home hours ago. Only the glow of the CEO's office remained. Daniel pushed his cart quietly down the corridor. As he passed the door, he noticed something strange. Clara Whitmore was still inside, and she wasn't working. She was staring at her laptop screen. Frozen. Daniel slowed, because on that screen, clear as day, was the exact security diagram he had been studying on his own laptop earlier. Clara looked up slowly, her sharp eyes locked onto him. You, she said. Daniel stopped. The room was silent. She turned the laptop toward him. Explain something to me. Her voice had lost its usual arrogance. Now it carried something else. Suspicion. How, she asked carefully, did the janitor fixing my laptop happen to be running a live analysis of my entire company's network architecture? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Because at that exact moment, deep below the building, the server alarm suddenly exploded into full emergency mode. The emergency alarm shattered the silence of the executive floor. Not the quiet pulse from before. This one screamed through the building, sharp, urgent, impossible to ignore. Red warning lights flickered along the hallway ceiling. Daniel's eyes closed for a brief second. Too late. Clara Whitmore shot up from her chair. What the hell was that? Before he could answer, the intercom crackled overhead. Security alert. Network integrity failure detected in server operations. All technical staff report immediately. Clara's expression hardened. Her gaze snapped back to the janitor standing in her doorway. You knew something, she said slowly. Daniel exhaled. I suspected something. The alarm blared again, louder this time. Down the hallway, elevator doors opened and engineers rushed past, heading toward the server floors. Clara grabbed her laptop and stormed toward the door. "You're coming with me," she ordered. Daniel didn't move. "Ma'am, I really don't. Don't start that ma'am thing," she cut in sharply. "You were analyzing my network architecture on a janitor's laptop 5 minutes ago." Another alarm pulse echoed, and right now, she continued, "my entire system is apparently collapsing." She stepped closer, eyes blazing. "So you're coming with me." Daniel hesitated. This was exactly what he had tried to avoid, exactly why he had buried his old life beneath a mop and cleaning cart. But the alarms kept screaming. And somewhere deep below them, the servers were losing control. He gave a small nod. "All right." They moved quickly down the hallway. Clara marched ahead while Daniel followed a step behind, pushing his cart without thinking. The elevator doors opened. Inside, the tension felt thick enough to touch. Clara stared straight ahead. "You're going to start talking," she said. Daniel leaned against the wall quietly. "Your system update earlier today opened a vulnerability." Her head turned slowly. "What?" "The patch modified your firewall structure," he explained calmly. "It created a gap between authentication layers. That's impossible. It's already happening." The elevator descended rapidly. "Someone outside your network found that gap," Daniel continued. "They're probing it." Clara stared at him as if seeing him for the first time. "You're guessing." Daniel shook his head. "No." The elevator doors opened onto chaos. Server operations had transformed into a storm of activity. Engineers rushed between glowing control stations. Multiple alarms flashed across giant wall screens. Data streams flooded the monitors like waterfalls. Victor Hale, the company's chief technology officer, stood in the center barking orders. "Shut down external access." "We can't." Someone shouted. "The intrusion's already inside the network." Victor slammed a fist against the console. "How the hell did this happen?" Clara stepped forward. "What's the situation?" Victor turned quickly. "Someone's attacking our system architecture," he said. "They're mapping our servers in real time." His eyes flicked toward Daniel, then narrowed. "Why is the janitor here?" Clara crossed her arms. "He might know something." Victor stared at her. "You're joking." Daniel quietly parked his cleaning cart near the wall. Victor scoffed. "We're in the middle of a corporate cyber attack and you brought the cleaning staff?" Clara's voice turned cold. "He predicted the breach before your entire department noticed it." Victor blinked. "What?" Clara turned the laptop screen toward him. The diagram Daniel had been studying earlier still glowed across the display. Victor stared at it, then slowly turned toward Daniel. "You drew this?" Daniel shrugged lightly. "Something like that." Victor's expression hardened instantly. "This is ridiculous," he turned back to the engineers. "I want every external port shut down now." Daniel spoke quietly. "That won't work." Victor ignored him. "Do it." The engineers rushed to follow the order. On the wall screens, network traffic shifted. Then, a red wave surged across the system map. "Sir," one engineer shouted, "it's spreading faster." Victor's face drained of color. "What?" Daniel stepped closer to the console. "You just forced the intruder deeper into the network." Victor rounded on him. "Stay out of this," but another alarm erupted, louder, more violent. A massive warning message flashed across the central screen. "Security breach escalation." Clara's voice cut through the chaos. "Victor." The CTO stared at the screen in disbelief. "They're rewriting our internal pathways," one engineer said. "They're inside the architecture." Victor whispered something under his breath. Daniel studied the display calmly. The pattern was unmistakable now. Someone brilliant, patient, strategic, and already halfway through the system. Clara turned slowly toward the janitor. Her voice dropped. "Can you stop it?" Victor exploded. Absolutely not. But Clara didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed on Daniel. The alarms roared around them. Server lights flickered like a storm of red stars. The entire room waited. Daniel looked at the cascading code, then at the terrified engineers, then at Clara. Finally, he spoke. "Yes." Victor laughed bitterly. "You?" Daniel nodded once. "But you're not going to like how—" Clara didn't hesitate. "Tell me." Daniel pointed to the server map. "You have to rebuild part of your network architecture." Victor threw his hands up. "That's impossible. That would take days." Daniel shook his head. "No." He stepped toward the control console. "It'll take 3 minutes." The room fell silent. Victor scoffed. "You don't even work here." Daniel rested his hands lightly on the keyboard. "Actually," he said quietly, eyes fixed on the glowing system map, "I know this architecture better than anyone in the room." And somewhere deep in the network, the intruder triggered the next phase of the attack. The words hung in the air like a challenge. "I know this architecture better than anyone in the room." For a moment, no one moved. Then Victor Hale laughed. Not a nervous laugh. A sharp, mocking one that bounced across the server room. "That's fantastic," the CTO said, shaking his head. "The janitor thinks he understands a multi-billion-dollar cybersecurity framework." Several engineers glanced at each other uneasily. Daniel didn't respond. He simply studied the scrolling data across the giant wall screens. The breach was moving fast now. Too fast. Every second, the intruder pushed deeper into Whitmore Systems' network, rewriting pathways and mapping defenses. The company's internal AI security program tried to respond, but whoever was attacking had already anticipated the countermeasures. The system was chasing a ghost. Clara stepped closer to the console. "Victor," she said quietly, "how much time do we have?" Victor's confident posture had begun to crack. If they reached the secure client servers, he muttered. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Everyone in the room understood what that meant. Millions of confidential files. Corporate secrets. Financial systems. If those were exposed during tomorrow's investor presentation, Whitmore Systems wouldn't just lose money. It would collapse. Daniel watched another wave of red alerts spread across the digital map. 2 minutes, he said. Victor turned sharply. "Excuse me? That's how long before the intruder reaches your internal vault." An engineer checked the traffic monitor. Her face went pale. "He's right." Victor's jaw tightened. "That's impossible." "We've got triple-layer encryption." Daniel nodded toward the screen. "You had triple-layer encryption." Another alert flashed. "Internal firewall failure." The room erupted with voices. "They're bypassing the security nodes. How are they doing that?" Clara's eyes moved from the screen to Daniel again. "You said rebuilding the architecture could stop it." Daniel nodded slowly. "It can." Victor crossed his arms. "And how exactly does a janitor rebuild a system that took my department 3 years to design?" Daniel's gaze stayed on the monitor. "Because the flaw wasn't in the system," Victor scoffed. "Oh, really?" "It was in the update you installed today." The CTO's face darkened. "That patch came from our top engineers." Daniel shrugged. "And it opened a gap." Victor stepped forward aggressively. "You're guessing." Daniel pointed at a blinking section of the digital map. Authentication layer 4. Victor looked at the display. Then, at the engineer beside him. "Check it," she typed quickly. Her hand slowed. "Oh." Victor frowned. "What?" "There's a gap?" Daniel nodded once. Between the firewall and the server handshake, Clara's voice cut in. "That's where the intruder entered?" Daniel shook his head. "No." Everyone stared at him. "That's where they wanted you to think they entered." The room fell silent. Victor's expression hardened. Explain. Daniel stepped closer to the keyboard. Your team is chasing the wrong breach. He pointed to another section of the system map, one no one had been watching. The real entry point is here. The engineer zoomed in. Her eyes widened. How did we miss that? Victor leaned closer. His face slowly lost color. Because the janitor was right. The attack wasn't where they thought it was. The intruder had created a fake vulnerability, baiting the engineers to focus on the wrong part of the system. Meanwhile, the real breach had slipped quietly through an overlooked authentication pathway. Clara whispered, "That's deliberate." Daniel nodded. "They're testing how you respond." Victor looked shaken. "But that means they understand your architecture," Daniel finished, "and they're using it against you." Another alarm shrieked. A massive warning spread across the central screen. Core network access attempt. The engineers panicked. "They're hitting the internal vault." Victor turned to Clara. "We need to shut everything down." Daniel shook his head immediately. "If you do that, the intruder will trigger the back door they planted." Victor snapped, "You don't know that." Daniel looked at him calmly. "I'm certain." Clara watched the exchange carefully. Her instincts screamed that something about the janitor's confidence wasn't bluffing. "You said 3 minutes," she said. Daniel glanced at the timer. "Now it's 2. Victor ran a hand through his hair. "This is insane." Another engineer spoke nervously. "Sir, we're losing more nodes." The wall screen lit up with spreading red. The attack was accelerating. Daniel finally rested his fingers on the keyboard. Victor stepped forward. "You touched that console and you're fired." Daniel didn't even look up. "I'm already a janitor," he said quietly. Victor opened his mouth to argue again, but Clara raised a hand. Enough. The room froze. She studied Daniel for a long moment. Her voice was calm. "Can you stop this attack?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "Yes," Victor scoffed. "This is reckless." Clara ignored him. "What do you need?" Daniel began typing commands into the console. "Control of the network core," Victor exploded. "Absolutely not." Daniel continued typing. "Then your company collapses." The words landed like a bomb. Clara's eyes flicked to the wall screen. Red warnings filled nearly every section of the system map. The breach was seconds away from the vault. She made a decision. Give him access. Victor stared at her. "You can't be serious." Clara didn't blink. "Do it reluctantly." Victor typed the authorization command. The system unlocked. Daniel's laptop analysis suddenly merged with the company's entire network. Hundreds of pathways appeared across the monitors. The engineers leaned closer. Because the janitor wasn't guessing. He was navigating the system like someone who had memorized it, and as the breach closed in on the company's most protected data, Daniel began rewriting the architecture in real time. Daniel's fingers moved across the keyboard with quiet precision. Not fast, not frantic, just steady. The kind of steady that only comes from someone who already knows exactly what they're doing. Lines of command code appeared on the screen as he rewrote portions of the network's internal pathways. The glowing architecture map shifted slowly, small sections of red fading back into calm blue. Around him, the engineers watched in stunned silence. Victor Hale did not. "This is unbelievable," the CTO muttered, pacing behind him. "He's modifying the core firewall." Daniel didn't look up. "Yes, you can't just rewrite a system that large." Daniel's hands paused for half a second, then continued typing. "Actually," he said calmly, "I can." Clara stood beside the console, arms crossed, eyes locked on the screen. The red alerts were still spreading, but more slowly now. "Explain what you're doing," she said. Daniel nodded toward the network map. "The intruder mapped your response patterns." Victor scoffed again. "Of course they did." That's what attackers do. Daniel shook his head slightly. No, they mapped your thinking. The engineers exchanged uneasy glances. Daniel pointed to a cluster of server nodes. You designed your security layers in predictable loops, he said. Authentication, firewall, verification, repeat. Victor snapped back. That's standard architecture. Daniel typed another command. Standard architecture is exactly why you're losing. Another section of the digital map shifted color as a pathway rerouted. One of the engineers leaned forward suddenly. Wait, he's isolating the vault. Victor frowned. What? Daniel spoke without stopping. I'm rebuilding the internal routes so the intruder can't reach the data. The engineer stared at the monitor. He's cutting off the entire attack path. Victor folded his arms. That's impossible. They'll just find another entry point. Daniel finally glanced up. They won't. Why not? Daniel returned his attention to the screen. Because I'm removing the map, the room went quiet. Clara frowned slightly. What does that mean? Daniel typed 3 final commands. On the central display, the glowing network structure suddenly shifted. Instead of neat, symmetrical pathways, the architecture rearranged into irregular, constantly moving routes. The red intrusion signals froze, then scattered, like a predator that had suddenly lost its trail. One engineer gasped. The attack stopped. Victor leaned closer to the monitor. No, it's still trying, but the red signals now bounced uselessly through dead ends. The intruder's carefully mapped routes had vanished. Daniel had turned the entire system into a maze. Clara stared at the screen. You changed the architecture. Daniel nodded. Now the attacker doesn't know where anything leads. Another alert flashed briefly. Then faded. The system stabilized. Blue lights replaced the red warnings across the digital map. The entire server room exhaled at once. One engineer whispered, "We're secure." Victor didn't move. He stared at the screen, stunned. How did you? Daniel quietly leaned back from the keyboard. The attack relied on predictability, he said. Remove that and the entire strategy collapses. Clara watched him carefully. You figured that out in minutes. Daniel shrugged. Not minutes. She tilted her head. What do you mean? Daniel nodded toward his cleaning cart. I noticed the vulnerability earlier tonight. Victor's head snapped toward him. You what? Daniel stood slowly. I saw the patch update create the authentication gap. Victor's face flushed red. And you didn't say anything? Daniel gave a small shrug. No one asked. Several engineers hid smiles behind their monitors. Victor looked ready to explode. Clara's voice cut through the tension. How did you even know where to look? Daniel hesitated. For the first time since the crisis began, he looked uncomfortable. It's just something I used to do. Victor laughed bitterly. Oh, please. He pointed at the console. You just saved $1 billion network collapse, and you expect us to believe you're just a janitor? Daniel didn't respond. Clara studied him carefully. Then she glanced toward the black laptop resting on his cleaning cart. The same laptop she had seen earlier, the one running the complex architecture diagrams. Her voice softened slightly. Daniel, what exactly did you used to do? Daniel looked down at the floor. The answer sat heavily in his chest. Because telling the truth meant opening a door he had spent years keeping closed. Victor folded his arms. Yeah, he said sarcastically. Tell us. Daniel took a breath. Before he could answer, one of the engineers suddenly shouted, Wait. Everyone turned back to the screen. The red intrusion signal had returned, not spreading this time, but pulsing steadily at the edge of the network. Daniel's eyes narrowed. That's strange. Victor frowned. What now? Daniel stepped back toward the console. They're still here. Clara stared at the blinking signal. You said you stopped the attack. I stopped the breach, Daniel corrected. The red signal pulsed again. Slow. Patient. Victor crossed his arms again. So what does that mean? Daniel leaned closer to the screen. His voice dropped. It means the intruder isn't panicking. Another pulse. Another quiet signal. Daniel's expression hardened. They're studying the maze. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. You mean they're adapting? Daniel nodded slowly. Exactly. And then he whispered something that made every engineer in the room go silent. They're better than I thought. By the way, if you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the moment everything changes. The red signal pulsed again on the edge of the network map. Slow. Patient. Almost curious. Daniel leaned closer to the screen, studying the pattern. The room around him had gone quiet again, the earlier celebration replaced by a cautious tension. Victor folded his arms tightly. So your brilliant maze didn't scare them away. Daniel didn't react to the jab. No, he said calmly. But it forced them to slow down. Another pulse flickered across the system display. The engineers leaned in. The intruder's signal moved slightly through the outer layers of the network, testing pathways, probing dead ends. Exactly the way Daniel had predicted. Clara watched the screen carefully. They're not attacking anymore. Daniel nodded. They're thinking. Victor scoffed. Hackers don't think. They break things. Daniel tilted his head slightly. The good ones do both. A young engineer sitting at the console spoke up nervously. Sir, whoever this is, they're scanning the new routes you created. Victor looked back at the janitor. And that surprises you? Daniel shook his head. No. I expected it. The engineer turned to him. Then why didn't you block the signal completely? Daniel rested one hand on the edge of the console. Because if we shut the door entirely, they'll disappear. Victor frowned. And that's bad because... Daniel pointed to the blinking signal. Because if they disappear, we learn nothing. Clara's eyes narrowed. You're studying them. Daniel nodded. They're studying us. The signal pulsed again. One of the engineers zoomed the map outward. Wait, it's changing pattern. Daniel leaned closer. The signal was no longer moving randomly through the maze. Instead, it began following a repeating route, testing the same sequence of nodes again and again. A slow smile appeared on Daniel's face. Victor noticed it immediately. What? Daniel tapped the screen. They're trying to rebuild the map. Victor blinked. That's impossible. Daniel shrugged. Not impossible. Clara crossed her arms. But difficult. Daniel nodded once. Very. The signal moved again. But this time, it hit one of Daniel's redirected pathways and looped back into a dead end. The engineers watched as the signal retraced its steps and tried again. Victor leaned over the console. How long before they figure it out? Daniel thought for a moment. 10 minutes. Victor's eyes widened. That fast? They're good, Daniel said simply. Clara looked at the timer on the monitor. Then, we don't have 10 minutes. Daniel nodded. No, another pulse flashed. The intruder was learning. Every second they stayed connected, they were gathering information about the new architecture Daniel had created. Eventually, they would adapt. Victor ran a frustrated hand through his hair. This is insane. We should shut the entire network down now. Daniel shook his head immediately. If you do that, the attacker will activate their failsafe. Victor glared at him. You keep saying that. Because it's true. Clara looked between them. What kind of failsafe? Daniel's voice lowered. The kind that releases everything they've already collected. A few engineers stiffened. You mean client data? One asked. Daniel nodded slowly. Victor's face turned pale. They already copied something? Daniel pointed to the edge of the map. They wouldn't stay connected if they hadn't. Silence filled the room. Clara inhaled slowly. Then we stopped them here. Daniel studied the blinking signal again. No, he said. Victor groaned. Of course not. Daniel turned toward Clara. We trapped them. The CEO's eyebrows lifted slightly. Explain. Daniel zoomed the system map outward. Hundreds of nodes and pathways lit up across the massive display. The attacker believes they're mapping our architecture. Victor folded his arms again. Because they are. Daniel shook his head. No. He pointed to a cluster of nodes near the network edge. They're mapping what I want them to see. The engineers leaned closer. You built fake pathways, one realized. Daniel nodded. Dozens of them. Victor frowned. And that helps us how? Daniel's eyes returned to the pulsing signal, because eventually they'll reach the one path that isn't fake. Clara tilted her head slightly. And when they do? Daniel typed a short command. A hidden section of the map appeared on the screen. The engineers gasped softly. The path ended in a closed digital chamber. Victor stared. What is that? Daniel answered quietly. A containment loop. Clara's eyes widened slightly. You built a trap. Daniel nodded. If the intruder takes that route, the red signal pulsed again. Moving closer. 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 Their system will lock itself into our network. Victor's jaw dropped. You're turning the attack back on them. Daniel shrugged lightly. Something like that. The engineers stared at the screen as the signal drifted through another fake corridor. Then another, slowly working its way toward the hidden path. Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. And when the trap closes? Daniel watched the blinking signal approach the final node. His expression was calm, called, precise. Then we find out exactly who's been trying to steal your company. The red signal reached the entrance of the trap. The entire room held its breath. And somewhere, far beyond the building, the intruder made their next move. Is this conversation helpful so far? The red signal hesitated at the entrance of the hidden pathway. Inside the server room, no one breathed. Daniel leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on the screen. The blinking signal hovered at the edge of the trap like a cautious animal sniffing unfamiliar ground. Victor whispered, almost unwillingly. It stopped. One of the engineers zoomed the system map closer. The signal pulsed once, then again. Testing. Clara stood beside the console, her gaze locked on the display. They know something's different. Daniel nodded slowly. Of course they do. The signal moved backward slightly, retreating through one of the fake corridors Daniel had built. Victor exhaled. In frustration. Great. So they figured it out. Daniel shook his head. No. The signal paused again. Then it moved forward, slowly this time toward the trap. They're verifying the path, Daniel explained quietly. Another pulse. Another cautious step deeper into the network. The engineers watched in complete silence. Clara leaned closer. How can you be so sure they'll take it? Daniel rested his hand on the edge of the console. Because the trap looks like the most efficient route. Victor frowned. Efficient route to what? Daniel pointed at the screen. To the vault. Victor stared at the pathway Daniel had designed. It looked perfect, direct, logical. Exactly the kind of route an experienced attacker would choose. But it wasn't real. It was a dead end disguised as a breakthrough. The signal moved again. Closer. Victor whispered, "This is insane." Daniel didn't disagree. The signal advanced one node deeper into the trap. Clara's heart beat faster. Almost there, the blinking red light reached the final node before the containment loop. Daniel's fingers hovered over the keyboard. One command. That was all it would take. Victor leaned forward anxiously. Do it now. Daniel shook his head. Not yet. The signal paused again, then slowly crossed the final threshold. The moment it did, Daniel hit the key. The system reacted instantly. The pathway behind the signal sealed. A digital barrier slammed shut across the network map. The blinking light tried to retreat, but the route was gone. Another barrier closed. Then another. The red signal bounced rapidly against the sealed walls of the containment loop. One engineer gasped. "It's trapped." Victor stared at the display in disbelief. "You actually caught them." Daniel leaned back slightly. Yes, the signal pulsed violently now, trying to escape, but every path led back to the same sealed chamber. Clara watched the screen carefully. "Can they break out?" Daniel shook his head. "No." Victor folded his arms again, though his voice had lost its earlier arrogance. "So now what?" Daniel typed another command. Data began streaming across the monitor. "They connected through a remote relay," he said. Clara stepped closer. "You're tracking them." Daniel nodded. The moment they entered the containment loop, their system began communicating with ours. Victor frowned. "That doesn't tell us who they are." Daniel pointed to the data feed. "It tells us where they are." The engineers leaned in as rows of numbers began converting into geographic coordinates. Clara's eyes widened slightly. "You're tracing the source." Daniel nodded. Victor scoffed weakly. "Hackers use dozens of relay servers. You'll never find the real location." Daniel didn't look up. "Normally, you'd be right." He typed another command. The data shifted. A new set of coordinates appeared. Victor's expression changed. "Wait." Daniel turned the monitor slightly so everyone could see. The signal wasn't bouncing through multiple countries. It wasn't traveling across anonymous networks. It was coming from a single location. Close. Very close. One of the engineers whispered, "That can't be right." Victor leaned toward the screen. "Is that?" Clara read the coordinates silently. Her face hardened. Because the source wasn't overseas, it wasn't some hidden hacker lab, the signal was coming from within the city, less than 2 miles away. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Well," he said. Victor looked up. "What?" Daniel tapped the coordinates again. "Looks like whoever attacked your company didn't need to break in." Clara's voice dropped. They were already here. The room fell silent. Victor stared at the screen. "You're telling me someone inside this city launched a $1 billion cyber attack?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." Clara's expression darkened. "Find them." Daniel studied the data stream. The coordinates began refining further. Building. Floor level. Specific network relay. The system locked onto the source. Then a final location appeared. Daniel leaned closer. His calm expression shifted slightly. Clara noticed. "What?" Daniel slowly turned the monitor toward her. The address glowed on the screen. Clara read it once, then again. Her eyes widened in disbelief. "That's impossible." Victor leaned over her shoulder. His face went pale. Because the signal wasn't coming from some criminal hideout. It wasn't coming from a rival company. It wasn't even coming from outside the building. The source of the attack was coming from inside Whitmore Systems itself. The server room fell into a stunned silence. Inside Whitmore Systems. No one spoke for several seconds. Victor Hale leaned closer to the screen as if staring harder might somehow change the coordinates. "That's wrong," he said. Daniel didn't move from the console. "No." Victor pointed at the address. "It has to be." Clara's voice came out quieter than before. "Where exactly?" Daniel zoomed the map further. The location marker shifted inside the digital blueprint of the building, level by level, floor by floor. Then it stopped. Engineering division. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. One engineer whispered, "That's our floor." Victor straightened immediately. "Impossible." Daniel's fingers moved again across the keyboard. The data feed sharpened, device signatures appeared, network activity logs, system relay identification. The trap he had built was forcing the attacker's system to reveal itself piece by piece. Clara watched the information scroll across the screen. Her instincts were already connecting the dots. This wasn't random, she said slowly. Daniel nodded. No. Victor scoffed again, though the confidence had drained from his voice. So what, you think someone inside the company planned this entire attack? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pointed to a specific entry in the log. Your attacker didn't just understand the network, he said. They understood how your team would respond. Victor frowned. That doesn't mean anything. Daniel glanced at him. It means they've watched your department for a long time. One of the engineers suddenly spoke up. Sir, the signal's stabilizing. Victor turned. What does that mean? The engineer swallowed. It means the attacker stopped trying to escape. Clara narrowed her eyes. Why would they do that? Daniel studied the blinking signal inside the containment loop. Because they realized something. Victor crossed his arms. And what's that? Daniel tapped the screen. That they're trapped, the room stayed quiet. The red signal pulsed again, but weaker now. Almost resigned. Clara leaned against the console, so whoever this is, they know we're onto them. Daniel nodded. Yes, Victor turned toward the engineers. I want every workstation checked. Now. The team scattered across the server room, quickly scanning connected devices and access logs. Clara stayed beside Daniel. Her voice dropped. You're very calm about this. Daniel shrugged lightly. I've seen worse. She studied him again. You're not a janitor, it wasn't a question. Daniel didn't answer. Clara sighed. Fine, we'll get back to that, she nodded toward the monitor. Where exactly is the signal coming from? Daniel zoomed the building map further. The blinking marker shifted inside a specific department cluster. Engineering offices, rows of workstations appeared. The signal narrowed to a single connection. Victor returned from across the room. Well? Daniel pointed at the display. Third floor engineering hub. Victor frowned. That's where half my developers work. Clara straightened. Can you identify the machine? Daniel typed several commands. The containment loop forced another data exchange with the trapped signal. Device identification appeared. Operating system. Network ID. User, login, credentials. Victor leaned over the console. His eyes widened. Wait. Clara noticed immediately. What? Victor stared at the name appearing on the monitor. That login, it's one of ours. Daniel turned the screen toward them. The account name glowed clearly. A senior network engineer. Someone with deep access to the company's infrastructure. Clara's voice hardened. So the attack came from inside. Daniel nodded. Victor shook his head slowly. No way. Clara crossed her arms. You know this person? Victor hesitated. Yes. The engineers nearby turned toward him. Clara's gaze sharpened. Well? Victor swallowed. He helped design the system. Daniel raised an eyebrow. That explains a lot. Victor rubbed his forehead. This doesn't make sense. Clara stepped closer. What's his name? Victor hesitated again. Before he could answer, Daniel's console beeped sharply. The red signal flickered. The engineers turned back toward the screen. What now? Victor asked. Daniel leaned closer. They're doing something. The trapped signal pulsed rapidly inside the containment loop. Another command attempt. Then another. Victor scoffed nervously. Trying to break out? Daniel shook his head slowly. No. Clara's eyes narrowed. Then what? Daniel's fingers moved quickly across the keyboard. A new alert flashed across the monitor. His calm expression finally changed. That's not good. Victor felt his stomach drop. What did they do? Daniel stared at the new message. They triggered a secondary protocol. Clara's voice turned sharp. Explain. Daniel looked up at them. If the attacker can't escape the trap, the screen flashed red again. They're going to try something else. Victor leaned forward. What? Daniel pointed to the warning spreading across the network. Now they're trying to erase everything. The engineers froze. Clara felt the tension snap tight again. You mean, delete the evidence? Daniel nodded. And possibly your entire server history with it. Victor whispered, horrified. They're trying to wipe the system. Daniel exhaled slowly. Exactly. By the way, if you want to see how this confrontation ends, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the moment the truth finally comes out. The red warning spread across the monitors like a stain. For a brief moment, the entire server room froze. Victor Hale stared at the message as if the words themselves might disappear. They can't do that, he whispered. Daniel was already moving. His fingers flew across the keyboard, commands appearing faster now, long strings of code cascading down the screen. They're not deleting the company, he said. Clara leaned closer. Then what? Daniel's voice remained steady. They're deleting the trail. The containment loop on the display began flashing rapidly. The trapped signal was firing off automated commands inside the sealed network chamber. Every command aimed at the same target, the company's internal logs. Victor felt his stomach twist. If those logs disappear, he said. Clara finished the sentence. We lose proof of the attack. Daniel nodded. And the identity of the attacker. One of the engineers shouted from another console. Sir, system logs are being overwritten. Victor rushed to the screen. How much? 30% already. Clara turned sharply back to Daniel. You said the trap would hold them. It is, Daniel replied, but they programmed a failsafe. The red warning timer appeared beside the log servers. Total log purge, 0241. 2 minutes and 41 seconds. Victor slammed a hand on the console. This is ridiculous. Daniel leaned forward slightly. No, his voice was quiet. It's smart. Clara's eyes flicked to him. Explain. Daniel pointed to the containment loop. The attacker knew getting caught was possible. Victor frowned. So they built a backup plan. Daniel nodded. If the system identifies them, he tapped the flashing timer. The logs vanish. One engineer shouted again, 40% gone. Victor ran both hands through his hair. Then stop it. Daniel's eyes scanned the network map. I'm trying, but the system wasn't cooperating. The deletion commands were buried deep inside the network protocols. Every time Daniel blocked one pathway, another appeared. Clara noticed something. You're slowing down. Daniel didn't answer. Victor snapped. What does that mean? Daniel studied the code carefully. They embedded the deletion command inside the architecture itself. Victor blinked. What? Daniel pointed to the system map. The moment the containment trap activated, a section of the architecture pulsed red. The wipe protocol triggered automatically. Clara folded her arms tightly. So the trap set off the bomb. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes. Victor looked ready to scream. Then why the hell did we trap them? Daniel didn't react to the anger. Because without the trap we'd never know where the attack came from. Clara's voice remained calm but firm, and right now we do know. She glanced at the glowing login credentials on the screen. The name still sat there. A senior engineer. Someone trusted. Victor swallowed again. This can't be real. Another alert sounded. System logs, 55% deleted. Clara turned back toward Daniel. How much time? Daniel glanced at the timer. 2 minutes. Victor shook his head. That's not enough. Daniel's fingers hovered above the keyboard. Then something on the display caught his eye. His gaze sharpened. Wait. Clara noticed immediately. What? Daniel zoomed in on the containment loop. The red signal was still pulsing inside the trap. But now it was sending commands faster, much faster. The deletion process accelerated. Victor pointed at the timer. It's speeding up. Daniel leaned closer. They're pushing the system harder. Clara's voice dropped. They're desperate. Daniel nodded. They know we're watching. Victor paced behind them. So, what do we do? Daniel didn't answer immediately. His eyes moved rapidly across the code, searching, calculating. Then suddenly, he smiled. Victor blinked. Why are you smiling? Daniel typed a new command. Because the attacker made a mistake. Clara leaned forward. What kind of mistake? Daniel pointed to the trapped signal. They accelerated the wipe protocol. Victor frowned. And? Daniel's smile widened slightly. And now their system has to communicate with ours more frequently. Clara understood first. You can track it, Daniel nodded. Exactly. He typed another command. The containment loop shifted again. Data streams burst across the screen, packets of information bouncing between the trap signal and the company's servers. Victor stared. You're forcing the attacker to reveal their connection. Daniel nodded calmly. If they want to finish deleting the logs. He tapped the screen. They have to stay connected. Clara crossed her arms. And the longer they stay, Daniel finished the thought, the easier they are to find. Victor leaned closer. But we already know the account. Daniel shook his head. Accounts can be faked. He typed another command. The data feed sharpened again. Now the signal was revealing something deeper. The true network source behind the login credentials. Clara watched as the system dug through the data. Location markers began appearing again. But this time, they weren't vague. They were precise. Room numbers, device signatures, physical hardware identification. Victor stared at the final results slowly appearing on the screen. That's a workstation. Daniel nodded. Yes. Clara stepped closer. Where? Daniel turned the monitor toward her. The location blinked clearly on the screen. Engineering floor. Workstation C-17. Victor whispered. That's his desk. Clara's voice went cold. Then, let's go find him. Daniel shut the console. Command window. But before he stepped away from the keyboard, another alert flashed across the screen. His expression tightened again. Victor groaned. What now? Daniel looked up slowly. The wipe protocol just jumped to 90%. Clara's eyes narrowed. How much time do we have left? Daniel glanced at the flashing timer. His voice came out low. Less than 1 minute, and somewhere on the 3rd floor, the attacker realized they had been found. Less than 1 minute. The words landed in the server room like a gunshot. Clara Whitmore was already moving before anyone else reacted. Victor, with me, she turned toward the exit. The engineers scattered aside as she strode toward the elevator. Victor hurried after her, still staring at the tablet Daniel had handed him displaying the workstation coordinates. Workstation C-17. Engineering floor. Daniel followed behind them without a word. The elevator doors slid open, and the three of them stepped inside. The ride upward felt slower than it should have. The red timer continued blinking on the tablet screen. Log purge 054. Victor paced inside the elevator. If those logs disappear, we lose everything, he muttered. Daniel stood calmly against the wall. We won't. Victor shot him a look. You sound very confident for someone who doesn't even work here. Daniel didn't react. Clara's eyes stayed on the timer. Can you stop the wipe? Daniel shook his head slightly. Not from here, Victor groaned. Fantastic. Daniel nodded toward the screen. But if we shut down the device sending the commands, Victor's eyes widened. The wipe stops, he finished. Daniel nodded. The elevator doors opened. The engineering floor buzzed with late-night activity. Dozens of developers sat at workstations under bright white lights. unaware that their company had nearly been destroyed in the last 10 minutes. Clara moved through the room with purpose. People noticed immediately. Executives didn't normally walk into engineering at midnight. Victor checked the tablet again. C-17 is down that row. They moved quickly through the maze of desks. The timer blinked again, 0:41. Daniel scanned the room. Most of the engineers were focused on their screens, headphones on, oblivious, but one workstation near the back corner stood empty, chair pushed back, monitor glowing. Victor stopped. That's it, workstation C-17. Clara stepped closer. The screen displayed lines of automated command code, deleting logs, system history, network records. Every second, the company's digital memory vanished piece by piece. Daniel leaned over the keyboard, still active. Victor looked around the room. Where is he? No one answered. Clara's voice cut through the noise. Everyone stop what you're doing. Heads turned across the engineering floor. Developers removed headphones, confused. Victor pointed at the workstation. Who sits here? One of the engineers stood slowly. That's Evan Mercer's desk. Clara's eyes narrowed. Where is he? The engineer looked around. He left earlier. Daniel glanced at the timer. 4:29. Victor cursed under his breath. He's running. Daniel shook his head. No. Victor frowned. What do you mean, no? Daniel pointed to the keyboard. The system is still communicating with the device. Clara understood immediately. He's still connected. Daniel nodded. Yes. Victor looked around again. You're saying he's still in the building? Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he opened the system's device identification panel. The connection signature appeared again, not just the workstation, another device. A remote terminal. Daniel's eyes moved across the screen. Clara watched his face carefully. What? Daniel slowly turned the monitor toward her. The command signal isn't coming from this desk. Victor blinked. Then where? Daniel tapped the second device location. Clara leaned closer to read it. Her expression shifted. Victor followed her gaze. Then his face drained of color. You're kidding, because the remote device location didn't belong to a workstation. It belonged to a private executive network terminal, one that only a handful of people inside Whitmore Systems could access. Clara's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. That terminal. Daniel nodded slowly, is on the executive floor. Victor stared at him. You mean? Daniel finished the sentence quietly. The attack didn't just come from inside the company. Clara's eyes hardened. It came from inside leadership. The timer blinked again. No 018. Daniel's fingers hovered over the workstation keyboard. If we cut the command signal now, the wipe stops. Victor nodded quickly. Do it, Daniel pressed the key. The workstation disconnected from the remote terminal. The deletion commands froze. The timer stopped. No 017. Silence spread across the engineering floor. Clara exhaled slowly. The logs survived. Victor leaned against the desk in relief. Daniel stepped back from the keyboard. But his eyes were already moving again, back toward the elevator, back toward the executive floors above them. Clara followed his gaze. You know something? Daniel nodded. Yes, Victor straightened. What? Daniel spoke quietly. The person behind this attack, he pointed toward the ceiling, is still upstairs, and whoever it was, had just realized their plan had failed. The elevator doors slid open onto the executive floor. Clara stepped out first. The hallway that had been quiet earlier now felt different, tense, heavy, as if the entire building was holding its breath. Victor followed closely behind her, still clutching the tablet showing the preserved server logs. Daniel walked last, his steps calm and measured. The lights from the city skyline reflected across the glass walls of the executive corridor, casting long shadows along the polished floor. Clara stopped outside the conference room. Inside, a single light was on. Someone was still there. Victor glanced at the tablet again. "The executive terminal is active," he whispered. Daniel nodded. "That means whoever launched the attack never left." Clara pushed the door open. The room fell silent instantly. 3 members of the executive board sat around the table, reviewing documents from the investor presentation scheduled for the morning. They looked up in surprise. "Clara?" One of them asked. "What's going on?" Clara stepped inside slowly. Her eyes scanned the room. One chair was empty. Victor noticed it too. "That seat belongs to." The door behind them opened. Footsteps echoed into the conference room. Everyone turned. A man stepped inside calmly, adjusting the sleeve of his expensive suit. Evan Mercer. Senior network engineer, the same name that had appeared on the compromised workstation downstairs. He froze when he saw the room. Clara, Victor, Daniel, and several stunned executives staring back at him. Victor's voice came out low. "There you are." Evan's eyes flicked toward the janitor standing beside the console tablet. Recognition flashed across his face. Then something darker. Resentment. Clara folded her arms. "Care to explain why your workstation just tried to erase my entire company's network history?" The room went completely still. Evan laughed softly. "You actually caught that?" Victor slammed the tablet on the conference table. 90% deleted before we stopped it." Evan glanced at the screen, then back at them. "You should be impressed," he said. Daniel remained silent, watching, studying. Clara's voice hardened. "You launched a cyber attack on Whitmore Systems." Evan didn't deny it. Instead, he leaned against the table casually. "I exposed a weakness," he said. Victor scoffed. "You tried to steal billions in corporate data." Evan shook his head. "No." He pointed toward the window overlooking the city. "I tried to show the investors tomorrow exactly how fragile this company really is." The executives erupted. "You sabotaged your own employer?" Evan's eyes burned with anger. "Your company," he corrected. "You built $1 billion empire on software that barely works." Clara's expression stayed cold. "Our system just stopped your attack." Evan smiled slightly. "Did it?" He looked at Daniel, the janitor, standing quietly beside the door. "I was wondering who fixed the architecture." Victor pointed angrily. "Him." Evan's eyes narrowed. "You?" Daniel didn't respond. Evan laughed again. "That explains it." Clara glanced at Daniel. "You two know each other?" Evan nodded slowly. "Oh yes," Victor frowned. "What does that mean?" Evan gestured toward Daniel. "That janitor rebuilt your network security tonight." Clara's voice sharpened. "Yes," Evan leaned forward slightly. "And none of you even know who he is." Daniel finally spoke. "That's not important." Evan smirked. "Oh, it is." He looked around the room at the executives. "You're all standing here accusing me of destroying your company." He pointed directly at Daniel. "While the man who actually designed your original security architecture is pushing a mop down your hallway." The words hit the room like thunder. Victor blinked. "What?" Clara turned slowly toward Daniel. "Is that true?" Daniel didn't answer. Evan laughed again. "You really don't know?" He shook his head. "Whitmore Systems didn't build its famous cybersecurity framework." He nodded toward Daniel. He did. The room went silent. Clara stared at Daniel. "You designed this system?" Daniel looked tired. "Years ago," Victor's mouth fell open. "You're the architect behind our entire network?" Daniel nodded once. "I used to be." Evan spread his hands dramatically. "And that's the real story here." He pointed at Clara. "You built your empire on his work." Then at Daniel. "And when he walked away, you didn't even notice." Clara's voice softened slightly. "Why would you leave something like that behind?" Daniel looked at the floor for a moment. Then at the executives. Then finally at Clara. "My wife died," he said quietly. The room fell silent again. My daughter needed me more than a company did. Victor slowly lowered himself into a chair. The revelation was sinking in. The janitor, the quiet man pushing a cart through the hallways, was the genius who had built the system protecting their entire corporation. Clara looked back at Evan. So you attacked the company to prove a point? Evan nodded. Yes, Clara's voice turned sharp again. Well, congratulations, she gestured toward Daniel. You just proved he's still better than you. Evan's confident smile vanished. And for the first time that night, the attacker had no response. For a moment, the entire conference room stayed silent. Evan Mercer stood frozen beside the table, his earlier confidence gone. The executives around the room slowly absorbed what they had just heard. The janitor, the man pushing a cleaning cart through their hallways, was the architect who built the security system protecting their billion-dollar company. Clara Whitmore looked at Daniel again, but this time her expression had completely changed. Not suspicion, not curiosity, respect. Victor rubbed his temples slowly. You designed the framework that protects every one of our servers, and you've been mopping our floors? Daniel shrugged lightly. It was a quieter job. Evan scoffed bitterly. That's your defense? Daniel finally looked directly at him. No. His voice stayed calm. It's my choice. Evan shook his head. You walked away from one of the most powerful tech positions in the country. Daniel didn't argue. I walked toward something more important. Clara understood immediately. Your daughter? Daniel nodded once. Yes. The room softened slightly at the mention, but Clara's focus returned to Evan. You sabotaged this company, she said coldly. Evan crossed his arms. I exposed the truth. You tried to destroy years of work. Evan gestured toward Daniel. You mean his work. Clara didn't flinch. And he just saved it. She stepped forward slowly. You didn't prove the system was weak. Her voice hardened. You proved you weren't good enough to beat the man who built it. Evan opened his mouth. But the words never came. Security officers appeared in the doorway behind him. Victor had quietly called them minutes earlier. Evan looked at the guards, then back at Clara. So that's it? Clara nodded. That's it. The guards stepped forward. Evan allowed them to take him, but as they led him toward the door, he glanced back once more at Daniel. You know what's funny? He said quietly. Daniel didn't answer. Evan gave a bitter smile. You could have had everything. Then he disappeared down the hallway. The door closed. Silence settled over the room again. Victor exhaled slowly. Well, tonight was insane. Clara turned back toward Daniel. You saved this company. Daniel picked up the worn cleaning cloth from his belt. I just fixed a problem. Victor shook his head. No. He pointed toward the server room below them. You fixed a billion-dollar disaster. Clara walked closer to Daniel. You said you left this world for your daughter. Daniel nodded. She's 9. Clara's voice softened. And she's proud of you? Daniel smiled faintly. She thinks I fix computers sometimes. Victor chuckled quietly. That's technically accurate. Clara folded her arms thoughtfully. You know this company was built on your architecture. Daniel shrugged again. That was a long time ago, but it's still yours. Daniel looked around the executive floor, the glass walls, the polished floors, the powerful people who once would have been his colleagues. Then he shook his head. I'm happy where I am. Victor blinked. You're serious? Daniel nodded. I pick my daughter up from school every afternoon. Clara smiled slightly. Most executives can't say that. Daniel turned toward the hallway. His cleaning cart still sat outside the conference room. The same cart he'd pushed quietly through the building for months. He grabbed the handle. Clara stopped him. Daniel, he paused. You may not want your old life back, she said, but this company owes you more than a mop. Daniel looked at her. We'll talk, Clara continued. But tonight, she extended her hand. Thank you. Daniel hesitated, then shook. A quiet moment of respect passed between them. The executives watched in silence as the man they had ignored for months turned toward the hallway again. The janitor. The architect. The single father who chose his daughter over power. Daniel pushed the cart down the corridor, the same way he always had. But this time, the people watching him understood exactly who he was, and none of them would ever look at that hallway the same way again. Now tell me the title of the next story you want. Subscribe, and don't miss our next story. Single Dad Mechanic was mocked by a billionaire at the dealership until the engine he built started roaring. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?